I tried to do as much of the work with hand tools that I could, and that depended upon the mood that I was in as well as the time I had available to perform a specific activity. But I didn't abandon machines altogether. I used machines for thicknessing rough wood, as I've got no interest in performing that activity by hand. I also used a miter saw or hand saw for crosscuts and a bandsaw or a hand saw for ripping. I can say that the bandsaw was the most used power tool for these three tills when constructing them, and that the table saw, which is a portable job site saw, was the least used power tool during this project. I'm finding that that's been the case over the recent past. I assembled the boxes using dovetails, hand-cut dovetails. No routers, no table saws, no bandsaws, and no jigs. And the approach I use is probably considered an older style approach, but I like experimenting. First, I'm cutting the pins first, and second, I'm removing waste with a chisel versus a fret saw. And yes, a fret saw is much faster, and I use a fret saw a lot, but again, I like to mix it up a little bit. This is what I consider a plus for the pins first method. Scribing the pins onto the tailboard is a piece of cake. But on the negative side, cutting the tails is a bit more difficult because you're cutting at an angle. So to compensate for that, I'm tilting the tailboard for a more vertical cut. When cutting dovetails, cutting to the line is critical. Cut beyond the line and the joint is going to be too loose. Cutting too far away from the line and the joint's going to require paring to get a good fit. Here, the top and bottom joined well with the side. However, I missed the mark on the other side, and that required some paring. But in the end, it worked out fine. Now, I already built the other two cabinets, one for my saws and one for my planes. The plane cabinet is in the center, and the saw cabinet is to the right of the plane cabinet, and it's got a rail at the lower front. This cabinet will be positioned to the left of the plane cabinet, and I wanted to mirror the saw cabinet. So I'm adding a rail as well as a shelf behind the rail for this cabinet. You see that I'm creating a knife wall on each side of my layout lines for the rail, and you can see how my saw drops right into that wall to start the cut. Here, a fret saw makes quick work of removing the bulk of the material that I need to remove, and I'm finishing it off with a router plane that gives me a nice smooth surface throughout. Once the rail was cut into both sides, I began the process of cutting a dado behind the rail. I found the best way to do that using the jig I set up to guide the saw was to use a panel saw, as it gave me the height clearance I needed so as not to hit the jig with the saw handle. And I made two shallow cuts, one on each side of the dado, using the reference lines that I made earlier. And I removed most of the waste with a chisel and finished the process with a router plane, leaving a nice clean and level bottom. For the shelf, I started off by squaring one end of the board, then cut the board to length with a handsaw, and then back to the shooting board to square the cut end. The shelf was just a little too thick for the dado, so rather than trying to enlarge the dado, I used a hand plane to reduce the thickness just a little, and that worked just fine. The glue up was pretty straightforward. For the record, I only apply a very small amount of glue to the sides of the dovetails, and that's really all that's needed to hold the joint together. I bring all the joints tightly together with clamps, check for square, and let it rest for a while. I wanted to recess the plywood back, so I'm using a router to create a rabbet on the back side of the case. The only issue with using a router is that it doesn't go into corners, so that material had to be removed with a chisel. And as always, I dimensioned the plywood backing using my track saw and TSO guides. And I'm just going to do a test fit at this point to make sure everything lines up properly, but I didn't want to close off the back just yet. I wanted to fit the front rail first, so I went back to the bandsaw to rip to rough width, followed by a little edge jointing with a hand plane to remove the saw marks. And as I was fitting it, I found that it was a little on the thick side, and so I just used a hand plane to reduce the thickness, and it was good to go. Once I was comfortable that I didn't need to access the case from the rear, I went ahead and screwed the plywood back to the case, and I just used ordinary pocket hole screws. With everything fitting together nicely, I installed the shelf and the rail permanently. By the way, I let the shelf float, it's not going anywhere, and I just glued the rail to the case. So again, this cabinet is going to be used for mallets, chisels, squares, marking gauges, marking knives, and so forth, so I need to make some handles for those particular tools. The plywood back is vertical, and to avoid any tool slipping off its holder, I gave most everything some type of lip or an angle to keep them in place. In some cases, like for my solid squares, I used the plow plane to cut a groove to house the beam of the square. In other cases, like for my Starrett combination squares, I cut a rabbet in the back of a small shelf to keep the square in place. For other holders, like for my woodpecker's Paolini rule, I cut a small dado to recess the rule, and that allowed the slider stop to rest on the wings of the material for support. Now for my chisels. I definitely wanted to lean the chisels towards the back of the case, so I adjusted my bandsaw to make an angle cut of a few degrees for the chisels to rest on. In addition to that, I wanted some support for the chisel handles to keep them stable, so I decided to hand drill holes for each of the chisels I would have in the cabinet. The holes are 1.25 inches wide, and I'm using a hand brace, and this definitely wasn't fun. But then again, I don't have a drill press. Once all the holes were drilled, I just sliced through the material like a loaf of bread to remove just a portion for the handles. So now I had the angle I wanted just for the chisels as well as the base, and now I needed spacers between the chisels to keep them secure. So I sliced and ripped a thin piece of stock and cross-cut the material in small pieces to fit between the chisels, and for now, I just laid everything out using tape as fasteners. Once I was satisfied with the alignment, I fastened the spacers using a pin nailer. Earlier in the project, after the plywood was cut, I laid out all the tools in their respective positions and marked their locations, and so now it's just a matter of fastening the tool holders to those locations. In most cases, I used 23 gauge pin nails. The exceptions were the holders for the mallets, where I used screws. And I fastened all 3 cabinets to the wall using French cleats. Here's a quick look at me loading up that last cabinet that we just built. And if you stick around for just a few more seconds, you'll see what all 3 cabinets look like today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.